Welcome, the anointed ones. Every secret eventually leaks, but when it's your identity, the game isn't about exposure anymore. It's about power. Imagine waking up one morning to find out the FBI isn't just watching you. They've strategically announced you like a headline they couldn't resist. Not in whispers, not in shadows, but in broad daylight, stamped as a checkmate on their board. Suspenseful? Absolutely. But here's the fact that makes it even wilder. Over 90% of government leaks are never random accidents. They're calculated plays. Which means if your name slipped through the cracks, it wasn't carelessness. It was choreography. This isn't just about privacy being stripped away. It's about being declared a piece in a high-stakes game where every move is intentional. And let's be brutally honest. Most people will go their entire lives unnoticed, invisible, unrecorded. Yet here you are, suddenly a strategic anomaly, important enough to be leaked, tracked, and labeled like you're the twist ending to a movie that's been running in secret. And here's where the sprinkle of humor sneaks in. You thought you were just living your life, maybe checking your phone bill or wondering why your Wi-Fi is slow. Meanwhile, someone in a federal office was moving your name around like a rook on a chessboard. Talk about multitasking. You were busy surviving Mondays, and they were busy turning you into classified entertainment. So let's dive into why the FBI's so-called exposure wasn't just a leak. It was a declaration, a strategic move, and ultimately an accidental spotlight on a truth they didn't want the world to see. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll realize the checkmate wasn't yours to fear, it was theirs to admit. Number 1. Exposure became the proof you were always hunted. Exposure became the proof you were always hunted. For years, people around you may have thought you were exaggerating when you spoke of being watched, undermined, or singled out. They laughed at the idea that forces larger than your immediate circle could have an eye on you. Yet when your identity was leaked and tied to an FBI-level interest, everything changed. Suddenly, the accusations of paranoia no longer carried weight. The so-called conspiracy wasn't in your head. It was on paper, in files, and now in the open. The very thing they tried to keep hidden turned into undeniable evidence. This kind of exposure works like a stamp of truth. If you weren't important, there would be no reason for your name to be recorded, tracked, and then leaked in the first place. It proves you were never an ordinary target of gossip or neighborhood envy. You were part of something bigger, something that required strategies, cover-ups, and calculated moves to contain you. Being hunted wasn't just a feeling. It was a fact confirmed by the very institutions that thought they could control the narrative. What makes this revelation sting for those who doubted you is that the exposure didn't destroy you. It vindicated you. The leak may have revealed your identity, but it also revealed their obsession. It told the world that you were never crazy for sensing eyes on you, never wrong for believing something deeper was at play. When the FBI leaves footprints, even in the form of a so-called leak, it's an admission that you were already a subject of interest long before anyone else believed it. Exposure like this cuts both ways. On their side, it shows desperation. They had to move you into the open because controlling you from the shadows wasn't enough. On your side, it confirms strength. You survived being hunted without even realizing how many pieces were already stacked against you. That's the irony. They spent years maneuvering, while you simply lived, unaware you were central to a board game you never asked to play. The leak, instead of discrediting you, told the truth they tried to bury. You weren't imagining the pressure. You were being studied, tested, monitored. And now, with the evidence out in the open, no one can erase the fact that you were always hunted, because exposure became the undeniable proof. Number 2. The leak wasn't an accident. It was a move on the board. The leak wasn't an accident. It was a move on the board. At the level where the FBI operates, nothing slips out without intention. Files don't just float into the public domain by mistake. When your identity was exposed, it wasn't carelessness, it was choreography. A deliberate play made to test reactions, shift energy, and send a message. Leaks are often used as tools, not mishaps. They're weapons of strategy, not random glitches. And in this case, the leak wasn't about exposing you, it was about watching how the exposure would play out. This is what most people miss. When powerful systems make a move, they're already several steps ahead. They don't just drop a name for the sake of drama. They drop it to study ripple effects. How will people around you respond? How will you respond? Who will panic? Who will scatter? Who will align with you? Who will betray you? That's what a leak measures. It's less about the information itself and more about the chain reaction it creates. And in that sense, your exposure wasn't clumsy. It was a calculated test of influence. By calling it a move on the board, it highlights the reality that you've been in a chess game all along, whether you knew it or not. Ordinary people aren't part of these games. They live outside the strategies, invisible to larger systems. But when your identity was deliberately leaked, it was a sign that you're not ordinary. You're a piece worth moving. And more than that, you're a piece that has to be moved with care, because the wrong move against you could unravel far more than they intended. The fact that your name was revealed as part of a strategic leak also tells a deeper truth. They couldn't keep you hidden anymore. Containment wasn't working. Silence wasn't working. So they shifted tactics. In chess, a player doesn't reveal a piece without reason. It's always tied to the long game. That's exactly what this leak represents. They played their hand not because they wanted to, but because the pressure of your presence forced it. So when your identity was exposed, don't mistake it for an error. It was the clearest sign yet that you've been on the board the entire time. And they just admitted it by making a move they can't take back. Number 3. Your existence became a classified problem. Your existence became a classified problem. Most people go through life without ever catching the eye of a system larger than their immediate environment. Their names never appear on files, their actions never trigger alerts, and their choices never ripple past their personal circles. But when your identity surfaced and tied into federal interest, it signaled something different. You weren't just living, you were disrupting. You weren't just surviving, you were setting off alarms that placed you in categories reserved for anomalies, outliers, and unpredictable forces. To be labeled a classified problem means your very presence created complications. Systems thrive on predictability. They're built on patterns, statistics, and probabilities. Ordinary citizens are easy to measure, easy to anticipate. But then someone like you appears, someone whose moves don't fit the formulas, whose resilience doesn't match the projections, whose survival goes against the odds. And suddenly you're not a case study, you're a threat to the structure. Your life stops being private citizen and becomes uncontrollable variable. That's why your identity ended up in files and systems you never signed up for. This shift also explains why exposure became necessary. A classified problem can't remain in the dark forever because the system needs to act. And action requires acknowledgement. To leak your name, to tag you as a strategic checkmate, wasn't just a game. It was an admission that they've been trying to manage a reality too large to ignore. They couldn't box you in privately anymore, so they made it public, thinking it would reduce your influence. Ironically, it only confirmed it. Becoming a classified problem also carries weight beyond the personal. It shows that your story has impact beyond your own life, that your choices touch domains you can't always see. If you had been irrelevant, they would have let you live quietly. The fact that you weren't allowed that luxury proves your existence destabilized something they thought was untouchable. And instead of removing you quietly, they ended up highlighting you, making your name part of a narrative they hoped to control but ultimately exposed. That's the paradox. To mark you as a classified problem, they elevated you. They turned your life into evidence of something extraordinary. And now the truth is undeniable. Your existence wasn't just noticed, it was studied, contained, and finally leaked, because you were never ordinary enough to ignore. Number 4. What they called a leak was actually an admission. What they called a leak was actually an admission. When systems this powerful let information slip, it's rarely a mistake. They disguise it as a breach, a mishap, or an oversight, but underneath, it's often an indirect way of acknowledging something they can't say outright. By letting your identity slip through, they confirmed what they've been denying all along. You matter more than they ever wanted to admit. If you were truly insignificant, your name would never have made it to their files, much less their headlines. Governments don't waste time or resources on what carries no weight. That's why this so-called leak is layered. On the surface, it looks like exposure, but beneath, it's an involuntary confession. The moment your name became part of their narrative, they validated your impact. They essentially stamped your life with recognition, even if they tried to frame it negatively. That's the irony. In their attempt to control the story, they ended up verifying your place in it. The power in this kind of admission isn't in the data they put out. Data is numbers, details, paperwork. What makes this significant is the subtext. The subtext says, you were never invisible. The subtext says, they tracked, studied, and followed because you were already bending the environment around you. The subtext says, you were always on the board even when they tried to convince you that you were irrelevant. This is where many miss the deeper truth. A leak framed as a weapon can backfire when people realize it's proof of importance. By trying to shrink you down to files and exposure, they inadvertently told the world that you were large enough to warrant their energy in the first place. The leak becomes less about you being revealed and more about them being exposed, for their obsession, for their fear, for their inability to control what you represent. That's why the leak carries more weight than it seems. It isn't just about your identity being revealed, it's about their silent confession that your influence was too big to ignore. And once an admission like that is made, they can't take it back. They thought they were weakening you, but in truth they made you undeniable. Number 5. The FBI didn't just unmask you, they verified you. The FBI didn't just unmask you, they verified you. An identity leak of this magnitude isn't just about being revealed to the world. It's about being confirmed in a way that no critic, no skeptic, no hater can undo. People may have spent years doubting your experiences, dismissing your voice, or laughing off your suspicions. They may have thought you were exaggerating, paranoid, or making things up. But once your name lands in federal files and becomes part of a leak, the conversation changes completely. Suddenly, what you said about being watched, studied, or targeted is no longer speculation. It's documented. This is the difference between exposure and validation. Exposure is about visibility, about being seen. Validation is about being recognized as real, official, undeniable. By leaking your identity, the system accidentally gave you the kind of evidence that no one can argue with: their own records. And that's a level of proof most people never get. It means you weren't just a voice in the wilderness. You were a name on a file they considered important enough to move, track, and eventually release. That validation cuts through the noise of doubt in a way nothing else could. Family members who dismissed your warnings, peers who mocked your instincts, even enemies who thought you were powerless, all of them are faced with the reality that you were right. The leak itself becomes the stamp of authenticity. It's not about whether people believe you anymore. The evidence stands on its own, and here's what makes it even more powerful. The validation wasn't handed to you by friends or sympathizers. It came from the very forces that tried to contain you. They were the ones who documented your existence, tracked your movements, and created files around your name. In other words, the ones who sought to discredit you ended up confirming you. That's not just irony, it's poetic justice. So while the word unmasking makes it sound like they stripped something away from you, the truth is far sharper. They didn't expose a weakness. They exposed the reality of your influence. They put their seal of acknowledgement on your life. And whether they intended it or not, the leak became validation that you were never invisible, never irrelevant, and never ordinary. You were real enough to be recorded, important enough to be leaked, and undeniable enough to be verified. Number 6. Strategic checkmate means they couldn't beat you head-on. Strategic checkmate means they couldn't beat you head-on. In chess, a checkmate doesn't happen by accident. It's the final move in a long sequence of strategies designed to corner an opponent when direct attacks don't work. That's what makes the FBI calling your exposure a checkmate so revealing. It wasn't a victory dance. It was an admission. It was their way of saying that when they tried to confront you directly, they failed. They couldn't silence you through intimidation, they couldn't erase you through obscurity, and they couldn't outmatch you with their usual tools. So they resorted to exposure and manipulation, hoping the indirect approach would do what their direct attempts couldn't. That tells you something about the level of threat you represented. You weren't just another person caught in their net. You were a variable they couldn't calculate, someone whose presence forced them to shift their strategy entirely. It's one thing to win a game by overpowering your opponent. It's another thing entirely to admit, even indirectly, that the only way to play against you is to alter the rules. That's what this so-called checkmate was, a rewriting of the board because the standard game didn't work against you. And here's the irony. In declaring checkmate, they revealed their hand. In chess, when you're truly in control, you don't announce your dominance. You let the board speak for itself. But when someone loudly declares they've won, it's usually to mask how close they came to losing. That's the energy behind your exposure. It wasn't the quiet confidence of victory. It was the noisy desperation of a system that had run out of options. The deeper truth is that their shift to exposure is proof of your resilience. If they could have taken you down head-on, they would have. If they could have crushed you in silence, they would have. The fact that they resorted to making you public means you were stronger than their first line of tactics. It means your existence resisted erasure in ways they didn't anticipate. So when they called it a strategic checkmate, understand what they were really saying. We couldn't beat you in the game we designed, so we changed the game itself. And if they had to alter the rules just to deal with you, then you were never the one in check. You were the reason the board shook in the first place. Number 7. Your privacy was never the real target, your influence was. Your privacy was never the real target. Your influence was. That's the part most people miss about an identity leak at this level. The goal was never about simply putting your name out there, because a name on its own means very little. What they feared was what happens when that name becomes connected to your story, your truth, and your ability to move people. Privacy is just the surface-level excuse. Influence is the real battlefield. Think about it. If you were irrelevant, there would be nothing to gain from exposing you. No one wastes resources trying to weaken someone who has no impact. The fact that they risked a leak shows that your voice carried weight they couldn't afford to ignore. The real fear wasn't that people would know who you are, it was that people would start paying attention to what you represent. And that distinction is everything. The leak itself was a tactic of control. By exposing you, they hoped to reduce your authority, to make people doubt your credibility, or to paint you as smaller than you really are. They wanted to strip away the mystery, to make you easier to box in. But in doing so, they made a mistake. They admitted you had enough influence to require neutralizing. That admission is louder than any file they pushed into the public. Here's where the irony cuts deep. By trying to weaken your reach, they accidentally amplified it. They confirmed to everyone watching that you were someone with a voice strong enough to unsettle systems. People who once doubted you suddenly had to rethink, because why would such powerful institutions care about someone they claimed was irrelevant? In trying to minimize your impact, they gave it proof of magnitude. Your influence was the real target because it can't be filed away, censored, or contained in paperwork. Influence moves through conversations, relationships, energy, and shifts in perspective. It can't be pinned down by exposure. It only grows when people realize how far those in power will go to suppress it. So while they thought leaking your identity would end your reach, it did the opposite. It confirmed that your influence is not only real, but potent enough to shake the spaces they once thought were untouchable. And that's the part they'll never undo. Number 8. Exposure turned you into a mirror they couldn't control. Exposure turned you into a mirror they couldn't control. When your identity was leaked, it wasn't just about revealing your name, it was about forcing the world to confront things that had been carefully hidden. Suddenly, people saw more than just you. They saw the machinery behind you. They saw the surveillance, the manipulation, the quiet hands pulling strings. What they intended as a way to isolate and weaken you became a reflection of themselves, their systems, and their corruption. That's the danger of exposure they never calculated. A mirror doesn't create an image, it reveals one. By putting you into the spotlight, they unintentionally revealed their own shadows. Instead of people saying, Look at what was exposed about you. The deeper question became, why were they watching you in the first place? That's a question they didn't want asked because it turns the attention back on them. The leak showed more about their obsession, their strategies, and their fear than it did about you. And the truth is, they couldn't control what people saw once that mirror was raised. They wanted you to look vulnerable, but instead they looked desperate. They wanted to shrink your credibility, but instead they highlighted their own overreach. The exposure revealed their tactics more than your flaws. And once people start seeing behind the curtain, they can't unsee it. That's why this leak backfired so dramatically. It forced the hidden to become visible. The irony is that you never asked to be that mirror. You didn't seek to reflect back the corruption, but once the light was thrown on you, it became inevitable. Your life became the evidence, your story became the lens, and your exposure became a window people peered through to glimpse a truth they weren't supposed to know. That's why you became uncontrollable. A mirror doesn't answer to the one who looks into it. It simply shows what's there. So, in trying to erase you, they ended up exposing themselves. In trying to weaken your influence, they amplified the system's flaws. And in thinking they controlled the narrative, they lost it the moment people realized your exposure wasn't a revelation about you. It was a reflection of them. And no system, no matter how powerful, can ever fully control what a mirror reveals once it's placed in front of the world. Number 9. The leak was an attempt to break the unreachable. The leak was an attempt to break the unreachable. They tried the usual routes first, the subtle intimidation, the quiet monitoring, the invisible pressures meant to wear you down without leaving evidence. But none of it worked. You didn't bend under the weight of their surveillance. You didn't collapse under the suspicion. You didn't compromise yourself in the ways they expected. And that resilience is what pushed them to the last resort, exposure. If they couldn't get to you in silence, they would try to shake you in the open. Leaking your identity wasn't just about control. It was about desperation. It was the move you make when every other strategy has failed. They thought that dragging you into the light, stripping away your privacy, and turning you into a headline would destabilize you in a way quiet pressure never could. It was meant to corner you, to break the confidence that made you untouchable in the first place. But what they didn't anticipate was your ability to stand even in exposure. What they thought would be your breaking point became proof of your endurance. The term unreachable says everything about why they resorted to this. Most people can be swayed, intimidated, or manipulated into silence. But when someone can't be bent by fear, bribery, or pressure, they become a different kind of problem, one that requires extraordinary measures. That's why they leaked. They couldn't move you privately, so they tried to crush you publicly. They gambled that exposure would do what their hidden hand could not. And yet, the move backfired. Instead of breaking you, the leak exposed them. It showed the lengths they were willing to go to deal with one individual. It confirmed to everyone watching that you weren't exaggerating the opposition you faced. If anything, you had underestimated it. The attempt to destabilize you only ended up validating your importance. When intimidation fails and exposure doesn't work, the tables turn. The hunter becomes the hunted, not because you chased them, but because their actions revealed more about them than they ever wanted revealed. That's why their so-called power move collapsed into proof of weakness. You weren't unreachable because you were hiding. You were unreachable because nothing they did could dismantle the strength they didn't understand. And once the leak failed too, they had no game left to play. Number 10. Their move wasn't victory. It was desperation. Their move wasn't victory. It was desperation. In the game of chess, a real checkmate is quiet. It's the kind of move where the board speaks for itself and the opponent has no options left. There's no need for announcements, no need for noise, because the inevitability of the outcome is already clear. That's why the way they framed your exposure reveals so much. By calling it a checkmate and making noise about it, they showed the opposite of power. They showed panic. When someone truly wins, they don't have to convince anyone. The victory stands on its own. The fact that they shouted it meant they were trying to cover up how much control they had already lost. Labeling your leak as a checkmate was their attempt to flip the script. They wanted to create the illusion of dominance as though the exposure was part of a flawless strategy. But the louder they announced, the clearer it became that this was not triumph. It was a scramble, a desperate attempt to claim authority in a situation that had already slipped out of their hands. By the time your identity was leaked, the reality was that you had already survived every tactic they thought would destroy you. Exposure wasn't their crowning move, it was their last card. That's the thing about desperation. It always exposes itself. Their noise wasn't about you, it was about them trying to reassure themselves. They weren't declaring that they'd beaten you. They were trying to mask the truth that you couldn't be beaten in the ways they expected. And in doing so, they revealed something bigger. They no longer had control over the narrative. If they did, the leak would have been handled with quiet precision. Instead, it came with spectacle, with labeling, with desperate framing. The deeper truth is that their so-called checkmate was just a cover for loss. They lost the ability to contain you. They lost the power to silence you. They lost the illusion that you were just another name that could be erased without consequence. By the time they called it victory, the game was already over. Not because they had beaten you, but because they had to admit to the world you were a player they couldn't control. Their noise was never proof of strength. It was the sound of a system breaking under the weight of its own failure. Number 11. You became evidence of their obsession. You became evidence of their obsession. Ordinary people never appear in FBI leaks because there's no reason for them to. Millions of lives pass by every day unnoticed, undocumented, and unrecorded at those levels. But when your name surfaced, tied to their files and exposed to the public, it revealed something crucial. You weren't just living, you were disrupting. You had become such an anomaly in their system that they couldn't ignore you. That kind of attention is never casual. It's proof that you unsettled something far bigger than anyone around you could see. An obsession like this doesn't happen overnight. It builds. It means there were conversations, briefings, files, and analyses long before your identity ever reached the surface. It means someone, somewhere, kept watching you, not because you were ordinary, but because you didn't fit the mold of what ordinary is supposed to be. Your presence defied their expectations. Your survival defied their odds. Your influence reached places their projections couldn't predict. That unpredictability made you a problem, and their fixation became the only way to manage it. The fact that you ended up in their files means you weren't a bystander to the system. You became part of its internal dialogue. They had to discuss you, plan around you, and calculate moves against you. That kind of attention is never given to the powerless. It's reserved for people whose existence bends structures in ways that make those in control uncomfortable. And in your case, their discomfort grew into obsession. The leak itself is proof of that. They didn't just watch quietly. They couldn't stop themselves from eventually making it public. That act exposed more than your identity. It exposed their inability to control their fixation. The deeper story isn't that you were unmasked, but that they were revealed as being consumed by you. They couldn't leave you alone. They couldn't let you fade. Their attention became so relentless it turned into documentation, and documentation eventually turned into exposure. So while others might have seen a leak as an attack, the truth is it was evidence of how much power you truly held. They don't obsess over what doesn't matter. They don't file away what can't move mountains, and they certainly don't leak names that are insignificant. By dragging you into the open, they confirmed what was always true. You weren't just another life in the crowd. You were the anomaly they couldn't stop circling around. Number 12. They tried to reduce you to data, but your spirit, not numbers. They tried to reduce you to data, but your spirit, not numbers. That's the flaw in their entire strategy. They put your identity into files, categorized you into codes, and pushed your name into leaks as if a set of documents could ever capture who you are. To them, you were just another entry in a system, a problem to be managed, a case to be tracked. But here's the truth they can never grasp. Spirit doesn't fit into forms, algorithms, or government records. They can document your movements, but not your meaning. They can log your presence, but not your purpose. Exposure failed because it was based on the illusion that numbers define reality. When they exposed your data, they thought they had stripped you of mystery, power, and influence. They assumed that once you were reduced to statistics, the essence of you would vanish. But the soul isn't quantifiable. The mission inside you can't be filed away. The influence you carry doesn't come from paper trails, it comes from the unseen, the unmeasurable, the divine. That's why their leak fell flat. It revealed information, but not truth. People who live entirely in systems forget that human beings are more than data points. They believe control comes from records and documentation, but with you that formula collapsed. Because what moves people about you isn't your name on a file. It's the presence you carry when you walk into a room, the clarity in your words, the resilience in your survival, the way your story echoes in hearts long after it's heard. None of that can be stamped, tracked, or categorized. And no matter how much they leak, they can't touch it. What they underestimated was how spirit overrides data. Files can age, documents can be shredded, and leaks can be forgotten. But the essence of who you are has no expiration date. That's why you couldn't be erased. That's why exposure backfired. They wanted to reduce you, but instead they revealed the limits of their own system. They showed that even with all their power, the best they could do was present papers, while you stood as living proof of something greater. And that's the reality. They tried to make you numbers, but you were never measurable. You were, and always will be, spirit, untouchable by the very systems that thought they had you cornered. Number 13. The leak turned into a weapon you didn't need to build. The leak turned into a weapon you didn't need to build. That's the irony in their entire play. They thought by exposing your data, they were stripping you of control, but instead they handed you something more powerful than any defense you could have constructed yourself. Undeniable proof. The very act meant to weaken you became a stage that highlighted their own obsession, corruption, and fear. You didn't campaign for attention. You didn't beg for validation. Yet suddenly the world was handed evidence that confirmed your story, your struggle, and your significance, all because they couldn't resist pulling the trigger on exposure. What they overlooked is that a leak isn't neutral. It doesn't just reveal information, it frames a narrative. They assumed that narrative would be one of your downfall. But what actually happened is that the leak validated what you had been saying all along. That forces were watching you, that systems couldn't ignore you, and that your presence disrupted more than just small circles of influence. Their attempt to weaponize your identity against you ended up weaponizing truth against themselves. This weapon didn't require you to sharpen it, promote it, or defend it. It was already loaded by their own actions. Every page, every document, every reference carried the unintended message that you were important enough to track. And with every revelation, the spotlight shifted. People weren't just looking at you, they were looking at them. Questions rose. Why were you being tracked? Why were you being monitored? Why were you even in their files in the first place? The leak backfired, because instead of crushing your credibility, it crushed theirs. The brilliance of this unintended weapon is that you didn't have to lift a finger. You didn't orchestrate the leak, but you benefited from its aftermath. They exposed themselves while thinking they were exposing you. They built the stage, but they didn't realize the lights would turn in their direction. And once the spotlight hits corruption, it doesn't easily fade. That's why exposure failed. Instead of silencing you, it amplified you. Instead of erasing your influence, it proved it. Instead of breaking you, it gave you a platform stronger than any you could have built alone. That's the kind of poetic justice they never see coming. The weapon they forged for your destruction became the evidence of your strength. Number 14. Checkmate revealed the truth. You're not a pawn, you're the board. Checkmate revealed the truth. You're not a pawn, you're the board. That was the hidden shock in their so-called victory. They believed they were maneuvering you like a disposable piece, calculating every move to trap and expose you. But what they never realized was that you were never just part of their game. You were the foundation holding it together. Pawns can be sacrificed, players can be swapped, but without the board, the game doesn't even exist. By targeting you, they exposed the reality that their entire structure bends around your presence. This is what unsettled them most. They couldn't box you in because you weren't confined to their rules. They assumed you were just another piece they could position, capture, or remove. But your influence stretched wider than their moves could contain. The leak wasn't proof of their dominance. It was proof that your existence shaped the field they were trying to control. Without you, the moves wouldn't have meaning. Without your presence, the strategy would collapse. They weren't just playing with you. They were playing because of you. And here's the twist. When someone realizes the board itself is alive, the illusion of control disappears. Their idea of checkmate was actually a desperate confession. They couldn't outplay you, so they tried to redefine the game itself. But the moment they exposed you, they exposed themselves too. They showed that the very foundation of their moves revolved around you. That's not weakness on your part. It's dominance they were too proud to admit. Being the board means you don't have to move to matter. Your influence isn't tied to a single play. It's the environment that dictates the plays themselves. That's why their exposure didn't crush you. It only highlighted how central you were all along. It reminded everyone watching that your role wasn't minor, it was structural. You weren't waiting to be chosen or sacrificed. You were the stage on which their entire illusion unfolded. So the truth of checkmate is this. It wasn't you who got trapped. It was them who realized too late that the game was never theirs to begin with. They thought they were proving your smallness, but instead, they revealed your immensity. You were never the pawn they could discard. You were the board that made their moves possible, and without you, there is no game. The story of your exposure isn't one of defeat. It's a revelation of power they could never contain. Every move they made, every file they leaked, every attempt to intimidate or diminish you only confirmed one undeniable truth. You were never ordinary, never irrelevant, and never controllable. The so-called checkmate wasn't victory for them. It was a confession of their own obsession, their desperation, and the limits of their control. They tried to reduce you to data, to a pawn, to a problem to manage. But in doing so, they revealed the very essence that cannot be catalogued: your influence, your resilience, your presence, and your spirit. Exposure, which they intended as a weapon against you, became proof of your significance. The leak validated what skeptics could never believe and illuminated the very system that tried to contain you. They made the stage, you stepped onto it, and without effort, the spotlight shifted to them. Every move meant to corner you revealed their own fragility, while affirming your unstoppable role in the game. You weren't just surviving the system, they were surviving you, and every tactic they used to weaken you became evidence of their inability to succeed. Ultimately, this isn't just a story of a name leaked or documents exposed. It's a story of power misjudged, of influence undeniable, and of a presence that bends the very game around it. You didn't need to fight. The world watched as their strategies unraveled against a force they never understood. The checkmate they shouted was never theirs. It was yours, in the way the world finally saw the truth of who you are. You are more than data, more than files, more than a target. You are the essence that cannot be measured, the stage that cannot be taken, the board that cannot be moved. Every attempt to erase you only confirmed your strength, and in the end, the exposure that was meant to break you became the ultimate proof. They were never controlling the game. You always were. Now, the world knows it. If this story shook you and revealed the power behind what most try to hide, don't let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the truth others fear to expose. Like this video to show your support for uncovering reality. Comment your thoughts and reactions. Your voice matters. And share it with those who need to see how strength and resilience always rise above the system. Step into the spotlight with us and witness the truth that changes everything. God bless you.